Hey guys, I apologize for the delay in uploading this video. I had some technical problems at school. I got home, fixed them all, so we should be good now. I want to kick off the next part of our unit here, talking about the Plains Native Americans. That'd be the people that were already living in this area that's now being taken over by westward settlement. And a lot of tribes that are going to come up here over and over and over again. The Sioux are a big one, living in parts of the Dakotas, into Wyoming, into other areas there. The Cheyenne, living in Wyoming, Colorado areas. The Nez Perce in Washington, the Apache and the Comanche out in Texas and Arizona, New Mexico, and many other tribes that are out there as well. The Blackfoot, the Arapaho, all the different tribes. One of the things we see of the plains especially is, and we learned this in class already, talking about the railroads, is that a lot of the tribes were semi-nomadic. That means they would move following food, different areas they would have. They maybe have a winter home. They'd also maybe follow the buffalo herds or other herds of animals in the summertime. Some of these groups did live in teepees, kind of seen the image I have here. Other groups may have different types of settlement as well, but many of them kind of had a hunter-gatherer type of existence that, as people started moving west, was going to force some kind of change there. One of the big animals that many of the Native American plains depend upon were the buffalo. Now, obviously, not all tribes depend on the buffalo, but some of the tribes on the plains did depend on the buffalo. And early on, there were millions of buffalo on the plains. I mean, as you would go by, you'd see just huge herds of thousands of buffalo. And then when the Native Americans used the buffalo, they used the entire animal. None of the buffalo honestly went to waste. I mean, the meat was used for eating, the bones were used for tools, the hide as clothes and as housing covers. They also used the leather for shields. The buffalo hoof was ground to make glue. The tendons, the sinew of the buffalo used as lashing to keep the whole thing together, used for bowstrings. The horns were carved into ornaments. Honestly, every single part of the buffalo was used. No part of the buffalo went to waste. Now, unfortunately for the buffalo herds, for a lot of the Anglo Americans, as they're called, white Americans, buffalo robes became very, very fashionable, especially right before the Civil War and the time after the Civil War. They used these nice buffalo robes. So buffalo hunting became a big industry, first of all. Some was industry, some was for sport. People would go out using high-powered rifles and shoot dozens of buffalo to take the hides to use for buffalo robes. That means the rest of the buffalo would then sit. Other people would shoot the buffalo just for sport. When we talk about the railroads in class, talk about how buffalo would be shot from trains. In a lot of cases, with the buffalo herds declining, it could rob some Native American groups of their livelihood. And we even saw a big changing lifestyle for Native Americans. Many Native Americans had signed treaties with the United States. Now, each of the Native American tribes was their own sovereign nation. That meant they were technically an independent nation, independent country living within the United States. So a lot of them had given up what was their native homeland and live on reservations instead. A few tribes did refuse, or different parts of some tribes refused. The Nez Perce, the Sioux at one point, the Apache, different times had certain groups within those tribes that opposed the idea of going to a reservation. But a lot of issues with this as we see a changing lifestyle happen. Here's an example of kind of how Native American land goes. 1492, before Columbus, we see how much land is controlled by Native Americans. By 1790, we see the first 13 colonies. By 1830, the whole West. By 1890, very, very little is Native American land. And by then today, even less. Even with this little area right here, the modern-day state of Oklahoma was originally called Indian Territory. And even here was a lot of Native Americans that had been moved west as part of the Indian Removal Act in the early 1830s. So the Cherokee and the Creek and the Seminole, the Choctaw, Chickasaw, all tribes from the southeastern United States originally were moved in here, and then even more tribes started getting moved in, and it became very kind of not good situation out west. And one big things we see too is trade. A lot of Native Americans would trade with white traders. And it wasn't a bad thing to trade things. A lot of times buffalo, other goods we traded for guns, metal tools, iron pots, ammunition, beads, all those kind of things were traded back and forth. For Native Americans especially, as they added guns to the bows and arrows they were used, it added to the power and their abilities to hunt, their abilities to fight as well. One of the things unfortunately traded in this whole situation also were germs, especially smallpox. A lot of Native Americans had not built up the immunity to smallpox that many European American heads or Anglo Americans had. And so there were a lot of tribes wiped out by diseases. Approximately 90% of some tribes were wiped out by Anglo American European type diseases because traditionally their bodies just did not have the defenses to fight off those diseases. So eventually we see the Indian Wars start up on the Western Plains, and a lot of times the conflict was over land. We had you know white settlers moving in, Native Americans being forced to reservations, land being occupied by farms and military posts, railroad lines. And while legally there were treaties that were signed to put this, a lot of times the treaties were unfair. There was language barriers involved here, where you had a treaty in English, but it's being told to people, and different ideas kind of fit in there to treaties. Not all treaties were signed by all tribal members. In some tribes there were various chiefs of various bands and various groups, and so some might agree to a treaty, others might not agree to a treaty, but the way the treaty read, it involved the entire tribe and not just a certain sections of the tribe. Even trades for goods were unfair. You trade lands for goods, but the goods are unfair because the idea of land ownership is very different between Native American culture and the Anglo or white American culture. And so even some of these treaties were forced in terms of military moving and those kind of things. And so the treaties that were signed usually weren't very fair. There's issues happening with the idea of the treaties, and honestly, Native Americans lost over 90% of the land that they had held for a long, long time. And if you're holding this land for a long, long time, there becomes conflicts then over that land. What eventually happens is that you see some Native American leaders start to come up. You have Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse from the Lakota Sioux, which are here and here. Chief Joseph, also of the Nez Perce. They start leaving the reservations that they're on. And so we start seeing kind of a conflict start over this land that's in the West. As the settlers move in, Native Americans trying to keep the land that they own. And so some Native Americans did fight back. There were some attacks on Native Americans, and kind of the popularized thing that gets going is that people getting scalped. The idea of scalping was a portion of the skull was kept to show how many people had been killed. And this didn't happen all the time, and even times when there were attacks by white settlers on white settlers and were scalped and blamed by Native Americans. So the idea of scalping was not, it got popularized a lot. But there were some very famous things as white settlers moved in and Native Americans started fighting back. There was one thing called the Fetterman Massacre. It was on the Bozeman Trail just right before the time of the Civil War. And essentially there were civilians and military escort that were moving on the Bozeman Trail, and they were attacked by a group of Native Americans led by Red Cloud, leading in about 200 people were killed in this attack. But at the same time, though, the states and the state militias and the white settlers were also not always, the victim here we're talking, okay? There was an event called the Sand Creek Massacre, where in 1864, this is in Colorado, and Colorado had a big gold rush right during the Civil War. And so a lot of people had been moved out to Colorado, and Colorado had made a treaty with the Cheyenne Native American tribe and the Arapaho. Essentially set up a 6,000-acre reservation, but not all people agreed with the treaty. It was signed by some members of the treaty, but not by all members of the treaty. And eventually, as certain Arapaho and Cheyenne would move off the treaty and continue the life they'd always lived, some conflicts broke out between settlers and the Cheyenne. Eventually, the Colorado militia, so essentially the Colorado, basically National Guard, if you will, came and opened fire on Cheyenne village. We're talking women, children, elderly people, those kind of things. It was not all warriors. And basically rode up, surrounded the village, and started opening fire with guns, with small arms rifles, and with big artillery guns as well. By the time everything is settled, over 200 Cheyenne and Arapaho were killed. A lot of them were women and children. I think a few of the warriors were able to fight back from the Cheyenne and Arapaho, but only 18 members of the Colorado militia were killed. So we see these events kind of happening back and forth. Now, the U.S. Army does make a response to this, and they send in the Army. After the Civil War is all done, they send the Army in. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer down here, very famous guy, very flamboyant military leader. He wore tailored uniforms made of crushed velvet and a big hat. He has long hair, all those kind of things. He came down with the 7th U.S. 7th Cavalry, and so they had 1,500 men and over 100 forts that got established trying to keep peace over 2.5 million square miles of land. I mean, honestly, it would be almost impossible to do this task at that time with the stuff they had. I mean, obviously, there's better communication now with telegraph wires and all those kind of things, but it was still very hard to try and police everything that was happening. And one of the things they try to do is make peace with different chiefs, like Sitting Bull, like Chief Joseph, and try to make treaties and make agreements to stop any kind of fight would happen. And one of the treaties that's made is called the Treaty of Fort Laramie, and that was made in 1868. Essentially, the Sioux tribe would move to a reservation in South Dakota, and one of the things in this agreement said that the Black Hill region, which is in South Dakota, right over here, if you've ever been to Black Hills, over this way here, is that would be, they would get to keep that region forever. The Black Hills are very important to the Sioux and be very, very important. Now, there are different groups in the Sioux tribe. There's the Oglala, the Dakota Sioux. And so Sitting Bull, member of Lakota, never actually signed this treaty. The Oglala Sioux signed the treaty, but expected to have their traditional hunting grounds that were left there outside the reservation. So there's really a lot of miscommunication throughout this entire process. And eventually, as we kind of leave off here, we'll pick up with this for the next online lesson here. But we see something happen out here in the Black Hills. In the Black Hills region, right here we're talking, where we see this treaty signed, they find gold. There's a gold rush out here in 1874, and all of a sudden, all these white prospectors, all these white settlers start flowing into this area, into the Black Hills. I want to find gold. I got to find gold. Have you ever heard of the show Deadwood? The show Deadwood is set right here in the Black Hills during this time. Now notice there's all these forts set up over here, and in fact the U.S. Army tries to find a way to keep the white settlers off of the Sioux land. But there's so many heading in, so few soldiers that it's just not possible. They can't keep these miners out, and all these little boom towns set up, and we're gonna see some conflicts that happen in the 1870s because of these things. Obviously, not the only thing that happens here, but it's a good intro to what we're going to talk about here. We'll talk about these topics more in class, guys. There'll be another lesson we'll do next week online, and we'll pick up from there, guys. Thank you very much. Make sure your notes are done. These are due for us on Tuesday. Thanks a lot, guys. We'll see you in class.